All right, well, I guess go ahead and get started, and we'll see if people pop on as they do and follow from there. So, first things first, my name is Lee. I'm the Director of Education at First Choice College Placement. We're a small tutoring company based out of Milford, Connecticut. And so we've been doing SAT prep and college advisement and things like that for about 20 plus years. And so we're kind of hoping to be able to share some of the things that we know and the things that we've done over the years. And with everything that's changing so rapidly, obviously with the current circumstances, we've been, keeping track of the updates, keeping track of all the information that's coming out, and making sure that basically that all of you can be as on top of things as we are. So there's kind of information about what's going on. And so this webinar is focused on the differences between um, the SAT and the ACT, and then talking about the differences in what they're doing. So, like I said, we'll take just a little bit longer to make sure everyone gets a chance to get in, and make sure that everyone can hear me and all of that. I've got a few people jumping through the waiting room, so we'll wait till it seems like everyone's connected. And in general, feel free to have the have video or not have video. Ideally, if you don't mind muting yourselves until, if you have a question, feel on mute and jump in, or put the mute, jump into the chat to ask questions. I will be keeping an eye on that as we go, so I can kind of answer anything you specifically might have. Like I said, in the chat, you should see a PDF file, which is just kind of what I'm going to work out of so you can have written down what I'm saying about the differences between the two tests. This packet doesn't have any specifics about some of the new updated information, so I'm going to talk about that and tell you where you can go to find that information in case kind of stuff gets lost along the way. Because again, there's a lot going on right now. Obviously, things like with the standardized testing has changed rapidly over the last couple of weeks, let alone over the last couple of months. So kind of it can be hard to keep track of what are you supposed to do, what are students supposed to do, whether you are guidance counselors looking to advise your students on what they're supposed to do, parents looking to figure out what on earth they're supposed to do, students wondering what do you do about standardized testing right now. So I think, like I said, first things first, my name is Lee. I have been working for First Choice College for about 5 or 6 years now. We spent a lot of time, we really try to work on finding the best plan and the best approach for individual students. That's kind of our big goal, is to let our students find the right colleges for them, and part of that involves getting their best scores that they can on standardized testing, because that is something that plays into a lot of college decisions, plays into financial aid packages and things like that. So today we're talking about the differences between the two tests and kind of what you should be thinking about. So the first thing I think I'm going to go into to start off with is talk about the differences between the two tests in terms of right now what's happening. So for those of you who may or may not be completely familiar with what's going on, both the ACT and the SAT typically run tests in the spring, but obviously in-person tests right now are not happening. So back in March, both the ACT and the SAT have kind of canceled their tests going forward. And so now we're looking, and about a week ago, College Board announced that they canceled the June SAT, which means College Board is the one who runs the SAT, ACT.org offers the ACT. So with College Board canceling the June SAT, that removes the possibility for students to complete standardized testing using the SAT before the fall of their senior year. Because now the available test dates that are kind of planned for the SAT is the already planned summer SAT. So that's August 29th. So that's at the end of August. An as of yet unknown date in September is planned. And then there's one first weekend of October, November, and December. So October, November, and December are the ones that they already had. The August 29th one is a standard one that they already had. And then there's a new additional one in September that they haven't yet announced which day it's going to be on. But all of that means that if you or your students are planning on taking the the SAT, that they're not going to be able to get that done before senior year in that fall, which is the same time of year as, they're going to be creating their applications. They're going to be expected to, be pulling together all of their letters of recommendation that need to be sent out, that they're writing their essays, that they're filling out all that stuff, and finalizing that list in order to reach early action deadlines or regular decision deadlines. So that can be really stressful for students. And so just keeping an eye on that. So it means that a lot of our current advice, which has always been to try to get standardized testing done before the fall of senior year, is just not possible. So that is one option, is that I know I have some students who are planning to wait until August 29th test. If students are planning to do that, they get priority. College Board has said that there is priority for students who are going to be going into their senior year and not have a SAT score. They'll get priority registration for those tests, because one of the concerns that everyone has is that the testing centers aren't necessarily ready to handle the number of people, since you'll basically be taking all the kids who would have taken it in the spring would in theory be now signing up for fall ones, and there are already students who'd normally sign up for the fall ones. So it's just possible that there's going to be a lot more people trying to sign up for fewer spots. So College Board has said that they're going to be expanding their capacity at various testing centers. That means bringing in more proctors, possibly bringing in more locations, but that they are going to expand it. But with that being said, they're going to try to give priority, so there will be a priority registration for students who fall into one of those two categories. Either that they do not have a SAT score on file, or if they were registered for the June test that was just canceled. So some students are going to hold out for that. Other students are going to look at the other option, and some students were already planning for the other option, the other test, which is the ACT. The ACT they are not planning on canceling their June test. So their June test is scheduled for June 13th with a possible makeup day of June 20th. So that gives you a spring testing date to potentially be done. Then they have a test in July. So the July test is another piece that's going to be, that's another in the summer, so they can get that done before the July 13th ACT. That would be before, right, their fall of senior year. So it's possible to get two ACT tests done before that time. So that's something to consider, especially for students who are really anxious about just having a score and just kind of doing something about it. The ACT might offer a really good option there. In addition, the ACT is further along in terms of their ability to do an online test and offer an online test, because ACT was already pre-COVID-19, was already working on producing an online version, something that could be taken not with paper and pencil. So that the fact that they kind of already had some of that infrastructure being developed and being put into place means that they're in a much stronger spot for, should things not change in the fall and should things still be doing distance learning, etc., that they would be able to do a test well online in a way the College Board has to kind of catch up to. So ACT in some ways is a sure bet because of that. So that's something to keep in mind for students, is that they may, even if they were thinking about the SAT, even if that's kind of what they were geared towards, that the testing dates and the potential of an online option might make more sense to focus on the ACT. College Board has also said that they are prepared to move online, and we kind of have some precursors of what that would probably look like by looking at what they've done with the AP tests. Since College Board has moved all the AP tests to an online format, we can kind of look at that to see what we can expect from College Board in terms of what online testing would look like. So those are kind of big things to keep in mind in terms of dates and numbers. But one of the big questions I always get when I talk about the ACT versus SAT with students is, which one should I take? should I take both? Are there reasons to take both? Do all the schools accept them, etc.? So that's kind of one of the things we're going to go into. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with the packet that, like I said, if you want to download this PDF for yourself, it should be in the chat that everyone should be able to see. So things that to look at kind of when it comes to this. So we're going to talk about the specific differences between the tests, kind of the different numbers, but the first part I want to look at is just what are some of the highlighted differences that are going to answer those questions that I was going into. So one of those big questions, right off the bat, everyone wants to, do all the schools accept both of them, which as of now is true. All colleges will accept both the ACT and the SAT, so that shouldn't be a concern for students. You know, if you had older students or older family members who kind of wanted to go to different schools that accepted different tests, a couple of years ago, the last holdout, I think, was Harvey Mudd, and they now accept both tests. So there isn't a reason you have to take one test based on where you want to apply, which is really good news for all students because that gives a lot more flexibility. So what you don't need to consider when deciding whether you should take the SAT or the ACT is you don't need to consider what schools you're applying to, because they all take both tests. As a general rule of thumb, that means that I don't typically suggest that students try to take both tests, because that's twice as much studying, twice as much kind of time and effort, as well as, you know, you have to pay for twice as many tests, right? These tests aren't free. So it's just a lot of potential problems with taking both, where it might be better for students to figure out which test is better for them, which one do they do better on, and then just focus their studying on that specific test. That being said, that's my advice in normal years is that they take some diagnostics, figure out which tests they're stronger on, which tests they like better, and then that's the one they should focus on. This year, there are some other considerations they should have. So like I am advising my students who, if they are strong, if they feel comfortable with both tests, if they kind of do okay on both tests, we'll talk about what that looks like in a minute, if they do equally well on both tests, or even if they just do a little worse on the ACT, but not by a really noticeable amount, then I am suggesting that they take a strong look and consider taking the ACT, simply because if those tests are going to be offered and they are actually going to happen in June and July, that just means a little bit of a weight off of them to take the test, be done with it, and kind of have a little bit of a more normal track of what it looks like to apply to colleges than if they have to wait until the end of August as their very first test score. Because if you have to wait till the very end of August, it's not just that it runs up against deadlines, because there is actually still plenty of time to take the August test, the September, the October, and get those scores in before those early action, early decision deadlines. However, it doesn't let them have a lot of time to review and study and practice in between those tests. So if the first test you take is August 29th and it's not a score that you're happy with, you then only have, you know, maybe 4 weeks before the September test. More likely you'd have only 2 or 3 weeks before the September test. So the reality is you're not going to be able to make a lot of changes between August 29th and whatever date the September one ends up being to improve. So one of the reasons why people should take the test more than once is to allow themselves to have a chance to improve in between the tests and to study the things that they didn't do as well on. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's an additional consideration that I wouldn't have been talking about pre-COVID-19. So all schools are going to accept both of them. So kids should look at the timeline, take that into account. The other thing they should take into account when they're thinking about which one is, like I said, do they do equally as well on both? So in our experience across many years of doing this, we have heard plenty of students give us it's a fairly persistent rumor that the ACT is the easier test. It is and it isn't. The biggest thing here is, one, there's a historical problem there. So a lot of people, that rumor that kind of wasn't as much of a rumor, it was a true fact that a lot of students did better on the ACT pre the 2016 revamping of the SAT. So back when the SAT was out of 2,400 points, when it had the you gain a point for a right answer and you lose a quarter of a point for a wrong answer, kind of that testing method, when it was like that, there were a lot of things about the ACT that meant a lot of students found it much more intuitive and did a lot better on it. However, College Board completely rewrote the test in 2016. It's a whole different, anyone who took the test pre-2016 wouldn't recognize the current SAT. So the differences in the things that they changed actually made the test look more like the SAT. So one of the things that we notice is a lot of the question types, there's more similarities to SAT, the structure, which we'll talk about this test by the numbers, the structure of the SAT more closely mimics what the ACT was. So there's a lot of little features that they really adapted. And so because of that, the two tests are now closer to each other, which means that the reality is that there's not an easy answer to which one is objectively easier. Instead, what we find is that about a quarter of my students who try it out do better on the ACT, a quarter of them do better on the SAT, and the remaining half do equally as well on both. So you can take an SAT score, take their ACT score, use a concordance chart, and compare the two. And for most of my students, they do just as well on both tests. So different students might have different feelings about how they did on the test. So some students just feel more comfortable after they've taken the ACT or feel more comfortable about the SAT. But in terms of the actual numbers, most of them end up doing about as well on both. So that means that even if a student has currently been planning to take the SAT, I know it's not uncommon for a lot of my Connecticut school students because they were taking the SAT in the school day SAT. And so because of that, a lot of them is like, well, they're already prepping for the SAT. So then they just kind of continue on prepping for the SAT since they kind of have to anyway. So, but for those students, for my kids who are planning on taking the SAT who aren't going to anymore, I highly suggest that they focus and work on the ACT now because most of them do equally as well on both tests. So it makes sense to study for the test that is available right now. And all the studying that they've done, all the work that they've done in terms of the content for the ACT, it's going to carry over for the ACT. So like, grammar rules don't change between the two tests. How the math questions are asked is going to change, but practicing algebra is going to help you regardless of which test you're taking. So there are a lot of things where even if a student has currently been on a track to prepare for the SAT, that doesn't mean they shouldn't take an idea and think about switching over to the ACT. So most of them will take both. The two tests, kids can get an idea of whether they would do equally well on either one. But at the end of the day, the decision of which one to take has to do with the time and kind of which test fits them better. So now go into kind of, well, what are the actual differences so you can get comfortable with them. So each one consists of 4 different sections. So on the SAT, you have, the SAT always goes in, the order is reading, then the writing section, and then 2 math sections. So one of the things we have to keep in mind and look at here is, so comparing the two, what is called the English section, the English test on the ACT, is the writing section on the SAT. So this is your grammar. So it's passages that have underlines that they're expected to, fix things like punctuation or verb tense errors, and then moves to things like rearranging the orders of sentences, rearranging the orders of paragraphs. So the English or writing section between the two is fairly similar. So on the SAT, you have 35 minutes for 44 questions. For the ACT, it's 45 minutes and 75 questions. So I find that students have to work a little faster on the ACT, but not dramatically so. So across the board, those two are fairly comparable. The reading section is one of the sections that is honestly very different between the two. So even though it doesn't look that way, when you look at passages and they will seem somewhat similar in concept, but the strategies and how students should approach the reading section, this is one of the places where I tend to see kind of really big differences in how students should approach them. So on the SAT, the reading section is the first section they get. It's 65 minutes, 52 questions. So that means that students have obviously more than a minute per question, but that also includes reading the passages, right? So they're expected to read a passage and answer 10 to 11 questions on each passage. So you don't actually have a minute per question, but you don't really need a full minute per question. So, but in general, for my students, unless students come into it knowing that they struggle with kind of slow reading comprehension and that that's a specific struggle that they know is an issue for them, so they're always the last kid to finish reading something in class, that type of thing, then most of them find that they have plenty of time to complete the reading section if they have a good strategy for it. So if they can kind of focus, we talk to them about splitting passages into sections and kind of coming up with an efficient approach. As long as they are doing it efficiently so they're not reading the passage over and over again, I find students have plenty of time to complete the reading section. Switch over to the reading of the ACT, and here I see some differences because the ACT, just looking at those numbers right there, 35 minutes, 40 questions. It's 4 reading passages, 10 questions per passage. Even if you didn't have anything to read, that's less than a minute per question. So right off the bat, the ACT reading section is moving more quickly. And so, but when you add in the fact that they're expected to read a passage at the same time that they are doing these questions, you can see how that's going to add up. So when I talk to students about the ACT reading section, it's a lot more about your skills at skim reading, a lot more of identifying where pieces of information are so that you can quickly go back, find it, answer the questions. Both of them are very heavy on evidence, so you're supposed to find the answer to the question based on the text in front of you, not based on any outside knowledge. So you're not expected to say, know something about the American Revolution and then produce that on the test. It's instead maybe you have a passage that's talking about the American Revolution, but you should answer the questions based on the text that's presented, not your memory of your AP US history class. So, but both of them are that evidence-based, but the ACT doesn't give you as much time. Now that being said, sometimes you will obviously, does that make the SAT reading section easier? And not necessarily, because while you have to move faster on the ACT, I think the ACT questions are more direct. They're a little more clear, a little more obvious. So they are questions that are meant to be answered quickly, relatively, to the rest of the passage. So whereas the SAT reading questions are often more in depth, they're a little bit trickier. They ask you to combine pieces of information and pull from more than one location in a different, more kind of in-depth way. So the two are just, honestly, they're fundamentally different, but I wouldn't say that one is easier or more difficult kind of on their own, but some students struggle more with one style than the other. So it's something that's important to keep in mind, and as I will be emphasizing later on, one of the best things students can do is work through some practice passages, maybe some practice tests between the ACT and the SAT to get a sense for which one is better. So then that's the differences on the reading sections. The other difference is the math sections. So the SAT is in our little breakdown here. It's listed like 80 minutes, 58 questions as if it's one section. It's not. On the SAT, it's 2 separate math sections. So you have a math section that is without a calculator. And so for that, students have 20 minutes and 25 minutes and 20 questions. So 25 minutes, 20 questions, a little more than a minute per question, but they don't have a calculator. That's one of the biggest things that honestly gets a lot of my students with the math section is just that initial, oh my gosh, I have to do math without a calculator. When talking to students about taking the SAT, honestly, I think it's one of the non-calculator math sections is actually one of the ones that is easiest to improve your score on, because all it takes is learning how to do math without a calculator, which isn't actually it's not like that's an advanced math skill, because we're not talking doing like logarithms without a calculator. We're talking doing stuff like your multiplication tables, working with fractions, stuff that's more elementary school to middle school math that they haven't had to do in a really long time. So the non-calculator math section I find tends to actually be one of the ones that students who apply themselves can really improve their scores, because what it takes is more just discipline rather than like innate math talent. So that's one of the reasons that I highly usually suggest that students take a solid look at the SAT, even my like less strong in math students. I tend to suggest that the SAT has a lot of benefits there, because while the concept of non-calculator math sometimes makes my non-math oriented students a little nervous, I think it's one of those things that you have really strong control over improving. So that's something to keep in mind. Then there is the second math section, which is the calculator section for the SAT. So on the calculator section, you have the remaining 38 questions, and you have and then you have 55 minutes to do it. So for the math section, then that's kind of your wrapping up piece. That's all about making sure and so making sure that it all makes sense, and that you get kind of, all the different math sections that you have, non-calculator and you have calculator sections. And so just keeping an eye on what's going on and what you're stronger on. And so for the SAT, the math is more heavily algebra based. So algebra is your main section on that. There's not a lot of geometry on the SAT math. So one of the benefits of the SAT math section is that they give you a lot of equations. So almost all of your algebra equations that you might want are available from the SAT math section. And so the geometry equations. So the SAT geometry questions, any equation for the most part that you might need is available in the beginning of the math section. That being said, there aren't that many geometry questions. So if geometry is a strength for a student, it's not going to show up as strongly on the SAT. It's not going to be a chance for them to shine. So that's something that some students should keep in mind. But that's the entirety of what the regular SAT's testing is. The ACT, on the other hand, you have one math section, 60 minutes, 60 questions, very straightforward, and you get your calculator through that whole section. It's more heavily geometry based, so there's going to be a lot more geometry on the ACT math section. And you don't get any formulas. So the ACT requires that students memorize and produce all of those formulas. Good and bad. For students who are strong in geometry, who find it easy to memorize those formulas, who've already got them in their heads, simple, they can produce them on the test. If it's going to be something that's hard for students, that's, again, something to keep in mind, / something that they should study for. Because something we've got to emphasize all the time with these tests, they are not tests of innate talent. They aren't even really tests of what you've learned in school so far, since they're not curriculum-based. They are tests that are meant to be studied for. They are not meant to be taken cold. They are not meant to just kind of be IQ or anything like that. They are testing, do you know the material as they're presenting on the test in different ways? So then the last difference between the two tests and their kind of baseline, what questions are available, is you have the science section. All right, so the science section on the ACT, kind of a notable thing that comes up. And it's one of the reasons I often get a lot of students who want to say, oh, I like science classes, so I should take the ACT, right? Or I really don't like science, I don't think I should take the ACT. Part of the kind of reality of answering that is realizing what it is and what it isn't. So the ACT science section is not, hey, I'm going to ask you, like, what is Darwin's theory of evolution? And you're going to, like, fill it in or choose a multiple choice answer that, like, fits it. The ACT science section is more reading and interpreting scientific information. So you get passages, often the passages describe like a study that has been done, followed by like data and graphs and analysis. And you are expected to answer questions that are maybe analyzing the graphs, analyzing the purpose of the study, seeing what the next steps of the study would be. So it's a lot more reading and interpretation than it is, say, reproducing or memorizing formulas. So that's something to, like, a negative for some of the students who are like, I love science because I'm really good at, doing science experiments. Obviously, that's not going to show up on this test. Like, you're not going to be able to prove that you're really good at titration on this test. However, for students who aren't as comfortable with science, who maybe the science section of the ACT, like that concept of a science section kind of scares them, and is a reason why they might be wary about taking the June 13th test, realizing that it's more of a reading and interpreting one where they get the information in front of them, and so they can practice that. That can be something that's really beneficial for students. So recognizing what the science section actually is and what it is not. And so the science section is one that I often find if students do not do really well in the science section when they take a practice test for the first time or the first time they see it, it's one of the most teachable sections. It's one that if they put some work into it, they can improve their scores relatively easily. Whereas I would say that the math on the ACT is harder to improve. Because to improve your math score on the ACT really requires that students like get better at doing the math. You know, they have to actually improve their skill, whereas science, it's more often getting better at figuring out what the test wants you to do, which are just different skills to work on and they are sometimes easier or harder to do. So that's something that's important to keep in mind. Let's see. So both tests, no points are deducted for wrong answers. They should try to answer every single question. That's very similar between the two. There are, for both tests, there is the optional essay. Some schools, there are occasionally a school that requires the optional test, the optional essay, and that's a reason why students should take the test at least once with the optional essay. However, it's not mandatory, and it might be something, usually I suggest that students plan to take the test with the essay the first time that they take the test, so that if they happen to get their amazing, perfect, everything they could have wanted out of it score that first time, they don't then have to go in on a next test date just to do the essay if they happen to end up applying to a school that requires the essay. That being said, in the current circumstances, honestly, it's kind of going to depend on the student. I think for a student who's already incredibly stressed out, who just really needs to do this test just to kind of get something done and to feel like it's okay, I might suggest they take it without the essay just to kind of shorten it a little bit, just to make it feel a little less intimidating. On the other hand, like I said, it's an essay that a lot of them are going to be fairly comfortable with the type of essay because it's read a passage and analyze the passage, analyze the persuasive argument between it. So that's something, especially students who are taking AP tests, it's very similar to a lot of what the AP writing essay questions are. So it's something that they should look at and think about. Main reason to do it with the essay the first time is, again, so that you don't have to go back and take the essay a second time, because unfortunately you cannot just take the essay on its own. You would have to take the entire test again. So it's just something to keep in mind for round one. But if a student knows all the places they're applying to and they know that none of the places they're remotely interested in require either the SAT or ACT optional essay, then there is no benefit to taking it if a school doesn't need it. So that's just something that they'll want to think about and kind of decide. Last big difference in terms of the math sections between the two, the ACT math goes a little more advanced. So the ACT math includes things like logarithms, matrices, sequences and patterns, so some more advanced math concepts. So that's something that can be concerning to some students who are not as strong in math taking the ACT. However, there's kind of two pieces to that. So one, there are only so many questions about those hard math concepts. So if a student isn't trying to kind of get those perfect scores, if they don't need to get a 36 in order to do well, get the schools that they want, they don't actually need to get those hard math questions right to get a really solid score. So that shouldn't necessarily be, and there aren't, it's not like all the questions are that hard math. So don't let hard math be a reason to be wary of the ACT. It's more if students are struggling, like trying to get somewhere closer to that perfect score, if they're looking at the IVs, things like that, and they know they're really not good at matrices and logarithms, like that's going to be a weakness, then the SAT might be their better option. So then that's kind of, something for them to keep in mind. But again, like I said, for a lot of students, those matrices, sequences, and patterns aren't going to come into play deeply in their score. And if it does, hopefully they are, kind of at a math level that those are things that they're able to handle. A lot of my students, often my upper level students, find that those are easier questions for them because it's what they're currently doing in class. And so sometimes those are actually easier than the geometry questions where they have to remember something from freshman year. So that's, again, things to keep in mind. But another kind of feature about this is that there's a difference between the math questions as they're asked. So I'm going to go in a second towards looking at some of those to kind of give you a sense for ways in which the math questions are different between the two. So while the ACT, I think, goes into harder math, generally speaking, I find ACT math problems aren't as tricky as the SAT ones are. All right, so stop this sharing for a second and share it again. So, looking at, in the packet, have a couple of different pieces about things, especially for focusing for students on tricks that they can use for the calculator section. Basically, an important thing to emphasize to all the students is that when you can use your calculator, you should use your calculator. So that's something to some parts of the SAT and on the entire of the ACT. So students should just make sure they're really comfortable using their calculator to do things well. So making sure they're comfortable with what all the buttons and functions can do. There's a lot of things with the graphing calculators that you're more than welcome to do on the test. Things like putting in an equation into the graphing side and then having the calculator actually do plugging in numbers for you using a table. All types of things that, again, we talk about them in our courses. Most of your, test prep books and things are going to talk about skills that students can use. A really good Google search on how to maximize my calculator. Those are all things that students should think about because those are skills that are helpful, especially on a timed standardized test where showing your work is actually not part of your grade. So things like plugging in answers, testing answers are all perfectly legitimate strategies for approaching these questions. So I just highly suggest that students take some time to familiarize themselves with the different features their calculators have. This packet goes into a few different ways that students can kind of use their calculator to help them out. So then the rest of the packet really just kind of goes into, so you can have, feel free if you've got kids, if you've got, friends you want to share this PDF with, go for it. It's just basically we have a sample section from each different test kind of put back to back. So in English, which is the writing section on the SAT, we have a practice passage from the ACT. So you can kind of see the way in which this is very, very similar to the English, the SAT, which is the writing section, right? It's the same underlines, fixing the underlines, changing things around. So this is all about grammar. Biggest suggestions for quick tips about differences between the writing, the writing section or the English section, what students should be focusing on. The biggest things they can do is, one, learn some specific grammar rules. So the ones that show up the most often that are, I think, easiest to study, punctuation rules and pronoun rules. Those are two concepts in grammar that in English grammar have actually really explicit rules about how they work, that I find you can guarantee that every passage on the test is going to have one or two punctuation questions, at least one or two pronoun-based questions. So if a student puts some time into studying the specific rules that punctuation and grammar talk about, then they can see some really good improvement really quickly without actually having to get a lot better at grammar. And for a lot of students, I find that struggle with these grammar questions, what it comes down to is that they don't actually know the rules. They know kind of ad hoc explanations. So explanations like as things happen. So they write an essay and their teacher points out like, yes, this sentence should be punctuated this way. I was like, oh, that makes sense in this sentence, but they don't know why it's the right reason. Like they don't really know why it's good. And honestly, most people don't anyway, like, right? Unless people have jobs as editors, this kind of nitty-gritty grammar rules aren't something that a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about. So it's something that I find if students want to improve their English and their writing section, really focusing on those nitty-gritty grammar rules, you can see a lot of improvement. And then looking at things, basically really looking at places that talk about some strategies. One of the really simple ones that I talk to students a lot when it comes to the vocab ones or transition questions is trying to read the sentences with nothing where the underline is, where the replacement is, and then think about what would they put there? What transition word or phrase would they have done before they ever look at the answer choices? Because then they have a really good understanding of what is the sentence trying to say, and then they can look at the answer choices to make those decisions and kind of compare it to what they've already thought of. So again, the writing and the English sections are ones that I think students can definitely see a lot of improvement with a little bit of work. Really careful practice and study. These ones are, something that students can do a lot with. The reading section, right? So one of the things I want to just kind of point to in the differences between the reading sections. So we have in here section, right, we see Mr. Hallstone would most likely think a clever woman to be one who. This is going to be like kind of an explicit or direct information. So if a student's trying to answer that, they just have to basically find the part of the text where it talked about how Mr. Helston talked about a clever woman, right? So it's like kind of more identify the location in the text that holds the answer to this. You can see it doesn't feel like a lot of, the answer's relatively straightforward in a certain sense, in that there's not real depth to, it's going to be in a specific paragraph or a specific line or two. Versus some of the SAT questions where we have things like author indicates the first efforts to invent underwater acoustic technology. So this indication ends up actually being like an inference that they have to draw. The SAT reading section has these notable, what we call the citing textual evidence questions that make up, I think, about 3 or 4 questions per passage where they refer to these line numbers. So what students have to do is both find the answer to the question, but also find which line of the passage specifically backs up that answer. And they sometimes have to get really specific. Like we'll notice that the lines in question will be sentences that are back to back. So a student has to realize, wait a minute, it's talking about lines 16 to 17, and then the next one's 17 to 18. So between those two lines, which one more clearly backs up the answer to the previous question? So there's a lot more, I think, back and forth decision making. So you have on the SAT reading, you have a bit of a slower pace. So that can be really good for some students with a lot of test anxiety, that they have a chance to really stop and think, and it's not just like go, go, go. On the other hand, other students do really well with that, like no second thoughts, you just kind of have to go forward. Students I find who second guess themselves a lot, who always go, oh, that was going to be my answer and then I changed it. Those students often do see a lot of benefit from the ACT because it just kind of forces them to go faster. They don't have time if they want to finish to kind of go through it. So something for them to keep in mind. And even if they've decided they're going to take the ACT purely from a practical standpoint, because the test is actually happening in June and July, I'd still, it's important to keep in mind that thing of, well, the ACT is a lot more about just find the answer, put the answer down, go to the next question, and to not let themselves kind of stop and think about it, and not to feel rushed even though they have to work quickly. So the math test, this is what they get to see for the ACT, right? So the ACT math set test, quick note that figures aren't necessarily drawn to scale. Things are in a plane, line is a straight line, average means the arithmetic mean, and that's it. That's all the details, right? So there is no extra information to help them, so they need to know all of that. Something I've heard students talk about in question is things like, can I program stuff into my calculator? A lot of, for AP tests and other things, it's suggested that you put notes, equations and things that are useful in your calculator. That is something that we have often advised. But for the first time in my experience, I have had a student tell me that they took a test and the proctor required that they clear their calculators. So it is actually something that's in the proctor's handbook. It's in their rule book that they are supposed to make students clear their calculator memories. Again, I've had one student out of many, many students ever say it's happened to them. But that is something that's really important to keep in mind. So students should feel free to program things into their calculator, but at the same time, they should be ready to not have it, to not have those programs, so to not have those equations on hand. So memorizing equations is going to be really important. But the questions a lot of the times I find are fairly, simple in the sense of like they're direct. They may be hard math, but what you're supposed to do is somewhat clear from the question. So like question 2, in the figure, everybody's horizontal or vertical, dimensions are in feet. what's the perimeter in feet? So it's very clear what you were expected to do, and then you have to go around and make sure you do it correctly. But we'll notice, kind of compare that with some of the SAT questions in terms of what you're expected to do. Ratios. Here's Fahrenheit to thermometers. It's by what percent did it decrease from here to here. There's a lot of just kind of what, even if you don't know how to do it, you know what you are supposed to do in some way a lot of the times on ACT questions. The SAT questions, on the other hand, tend to be what I call, it's like they're trickier questions. So the math itself may not be horrifically complicated, but the questions are a little different. So the calculator section on the SAT, you get this, right? And this is also on the non-calculator section, except it just says use of calculators not permitted. But they get all of these nice geometry formulas. So for students who really struggle with memorizing formulas, that's something that the SAT offers. Downside is these formulas only come in handy for like one or two of the whole questions. So there's that. But the questions tend to be things a little trickier, like question 2 here, that we have this question about grocery store. We're given basically find an equation that represents what's going on. But what they're doing, there's some really subtle tricks to this one, where basically most students, it's a tax and you're applying this tax to the cost of the groceries. So most students are inclined towards choosing something like A because it's, oh, the tax is, let's say, 7%. So 7 out of 100, well, that seems like what you do for percentages. And you add $2.50 because it's not taxed, so that should be outside of it. And all that seems reasonable until you have them plug a number in and try it out. And what happens is that 7 out of 100, that's less than 1, which means that that's going to make that 78.53 go down. And there's no way that you apply to taxes somewhere and you suddenly pay less, right? So where did this random plus 100 come from? That's where the tricky comes in. It's not intuitive at first until you run some numbers in. And for some students, they're not going to notice like at all. That's going to be really easy for them. But other students are going to struggle with seeing those kinds of little tricks. So I find the SAT, once students know to look for them, a lot of the times they can get through them just fine. But it is important to notice that the SAT, I think, the math is trickier, not necessarily harder. Things like on the SAT, this scatter plot, you can see that they draw the axes, the scales are really kind of wonky. So it's things that just a student who's rushing, a student who's trying to work through really quickly is going to miss. And so I think there's a lot more detail and tricky questions on the SAT rather than the ACT. And then, as I said, you also have the SAT has the non-calculator. The one other big difference on the SAT, you have these open-ended questions. So there are always, the final section of the SAT involves, you move away from after 30 multiple choice questions, all of a sudden we have questions that students have to fill in the blanks. And so these are things that are really important for students to look at, because these questions aren't actually any harder than the rest of the test. They are just as straight, they're the same questions, the same difficulty categories, but taking away students' multiple choice question answers makes them seem so much harder. So that's something that students should keep in mind. And they should look over these rules for how to do the grid-ins before they go into the test, because these rules stay the same every single time. How you're supposed to grid in it, what's accepted, what's not accepted. They should read this and learn it before they go in, because that's not something you need to read on the test. It'll lose time if you have to. But it is something I have seen students taking practice tests, and I'm hoping they don't do it on the real test. But I have seen students who ultimately they would get the question wrong because instead of doing 2/3 or 0.666 or 0.667, all of which are equal and considered a correct answer by College Board, if they do 0.66, putting that 0 in the front place the way that they're trained to do because it's right, they'll get the question wrong. So that's just because of the way that College Board grades and because of the way that they determine putting in the maximum number of digits. So it's just something that's really important, little subtle details like that that are the teaching to the test, things that can slip people's mind, but that are just as important as actually getting the math right, is filling in the blanks properly. So something to also keep in mind. And so I mostly, I focus a lot on teaching the kids with the open-ended, so that they're not actually any more difficult, but that they have specific strategies that work better. And things like students should maybe start with the grid-ins, start with what these open-ended, which are what we call grid-ins, because taking answer choices away from someone makes them seem harder. But if you start without answer choices and give them, and then you go to questions that do have answer choices, it doesn't have that steep difficulty. So that's something to keep in mind. So that's kind of, again, feel free, you'll have this packet. So the last is the science test, so a section showing that. And this is exactly what students are going to see, right? They're going to see passages, tables, and then answer questions based on those passages and tables. So it's not science like recall information. It's not like the subject tests where you're expected to know information. It's easier often if you do happen to have some familiarity with some of it, but all the information is actually there in the passage. So students should definitely look at the science sections, try out some of those questions. If they struggle with it, they should definitely look for some kind of test prep, because there's a lot that can be done to help students with this. And it's not something that they should, some students do really well just trying to learn stuff on their own. And if so, they should feel more than empowered to do that. But for a lot of them, it's really helpful just to have someone else help guide them a little bit. So I think that pretty much wraps up everything that I specifically want to talk about the differences between the two tests. Hopefully you guys have a sense for what are the differences, what can you expect on both, which is kind of for normal years, just the structural differences. But like I said at the beginning, there's some of the decisions this year may be made just based on options and what's available. And so hopefully kind of what's out there is now a little bit clearer, basically, that you can take the ACT as of now. It's still happening in June and July. The SAT will be happening until August, so that may affect your plans, and that students should pay attention to registration deadlines. They should pay attention if they were scheduled for the June SAT. They should look out for those emails about early registration. Students shouldn't be afraid to switch gears if they were already planning on taking the SAT. They shouldn't be afraid of switching to the ACT. They're more than capable of handling it, and there are resources out there to help them get ready for either test. We are offering an online ACT course set up for the June ACT, so students can go to our website and sign up for that. It'll be twice a week. I believe it starts May 5th, something like that. And so there is time. And so, but it's important that they get kind of help and get the right things that work for them. So I guess to wrap this, if anyone has any specific questions they want to ask about anything ACT, SAT, general college process questions, feel free to ask in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask from, out loud, anything like that. I am more than happy to answer. The July date for the ACT is July, let me double check. It is July 13th. And then the possible makeup date for it is, I believe, the week after. There's some talk that ACT may move all of them by 1 week. But yeah, July 13th is the current time. Requirements in terms of I think if second candidate, I'm not sure what exactly their policies are as far as their online. I believe they've got refund setups, they've got an ability to cancel. I'm not sure exactly when their online setup is being launched. So far, the details that I've seen have been for the fall. So as far as I'm aware, for the summer ones, so if you're sick and can't attend, as far as I know, you can cancel, possibly with a deadline up to right before it. But I think right now a lot of them are being fairly flexible with a lot of their already in place requirements. So while they may have various policies, if the reason you can't attend is sickness or test centers closing or any of that, they do have policies in place. So yes, so one of the things, download this presentation. So we should get a recording. I believe you're all now, because you registered for this, we should have all of your emails. So once this is over, we'll have a recording. So I will make sure that it is sent out to all of you guys so you can forward it to any of you who have students, show it to anyone who's interested in. And through our website, we do have potential sample tests and sample diagnostics. We have a 1-hour SAT test that students can take. Alternatively, what we typically have students do is take a practice SAT, take a practice ACT, and then we can grade them if you send them to us, and we can go from there. But yes, so through our website. And if you need any details on how that could work, you can shoot us an email at info@firstchoicecollege.com. And that's probably the easiest way, and we can kind of touch base with whether your students should send it to us or send things to you, and we can process from there. All right, and if it seems like that's most questions, feel free to, if you want to stick around, I will be on for the last couple of minutes, but thank you all for attending. And like I said, let us know if you have any questions. We're doing our best to kind of keep on top of the information that we can so that we can keep everyone up to date. But hope everyone is doing well and surviving all of this.